Or they told Elijah Drummond to use the service entrance. Not in so many words. Nobody in the Halcourt building ever said anything in so many words. 4. That wasn't how things worked at one of downtown Toronto's most prestigious architectural firms. At Whitmore Associates. 4. The message always came wrapped in something soft. A glance that lasted a half-second too long, a seating arrangement at a meeting that put you at the far end of the table, for a parking spot reassigned, without explanation. 4. Elijah Drummond had been receiving these messages for 11 months. He had been reading them perfectly. He just hadn't said so yet. On the morning of March 4th, 4. Drummond walked through the main entrance of the Halcourt, building the same way he always did. Pressed charcoal coat, leather portfolio under one arm, coffee from the Vietnamese place on Adelaide Street. 4. Not Starbucks, because Drummond had opinions about coffee, and he didn't keep them to himself when someone asked. He nodded. At the security desk. The guard nodded back. Drummond took the elevator to the 14th floor and settled into his office, the one with the window that looked out over the rail corridor, not the lake view that went to the Junior Associates, who'd been there 3 years and knew how to laugh at the right moments during Whitmore's Monday morning stand-ups. Drummond set his coffee down. He opened his portfolio. 4. He looked at the drawings he'd been refining for 6 weeks, and for a moment, just a moment, something in his chest went very still and very quiet. He had been here before. Not this office, not this city exactly, but this feeling. The feeling of being very good at something in a room full of people who had already decided. Before you opened your mouth, what category you belonged in. He picked up his pencil. He got to work. 4. Drummond had come to Whitmore Associates through a lateral hire that still made certain people uncomfortable to discuss. He hadn't applied through the usual channels. He hadn't been recruited from one of the partner feeder universities. 4. He'd been personally brought in by Renata Osei Frempong, not the Philippa from the list, an entirely different woman, who had been head of urban development projects before she took a position in Vancouver and left Drummond, as she later told him on the phone, holding the good work and surrounded by people who will try to take credit for it. Renata had not been wrong. Drummond was 51. 4. He had spent 14 years at a mid-size firm in Hamilton, where he'd designed 3 community centers, a library addition that won a regional award, and a mixed-income residential development in the East End that had become, quietly and without ceremony, one of the most livable blocks in the city. He didn't have a profile. He didn't attend the right galas. 4. He drove a 12-year-old Volvo that he maintained himself on weekends in his garage in Scarborough, which was where he lived, in a house he'd renovated room by room over 20 years. 4. The kind of house that said nothing flashy about the person inside it, and contained in every corner evidence of extraordinary care. 4. His ex-wife, Natalie, used to say that Drummond built things the way some people pray. Quietly, completely, with full attention on what would last. They were still friends. 4. She said this about him fondly. At Whitmore Associates, Drummond had been brought in to lead the Lakeview Commons project, a $340 million mixed-use development on Toronto's waterfront that was, 4. Depending on who you asked, either the firm's most important commission in a decade or a politically complex nightmare that 3 previous project leads had quietly stepped away from. 4. Drummond hadn't been told about the 3 previous leads when he accepted. 4. He found out from a junior drafter named Yusuf, who mentioned it in passing during their second week working together. The way people mention things they assume you already know. 4. Drummond had set down his coffee. This was a recurring gesture, setting down the coffee, and said, 3. Yusuf had looked suddenly uncertain about whether he'd said something wrong. Don't worry about it, Drummond said. Tell me why they left. Yusuf told him. 4. It took 20 minutes and involved the names of 4 city councilors, two heritage advocacy groups, a drainage dispute that went back to 1987, and a senior partner named Colton Havershaw, who had, according to Yusuf's careful phrasing, strong opinions about the direction of the project. Drummond had listened to all of it without interrupting. He picked up his pencil and said, "Okay." Colton Havershaw was 58, third-generation architect, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had never had to earn the benefit of the doubt, because it had simply always been extended to him, like a hand from a very old friend. He wasn't cruel. Exactly. Cruelty requires intention. 4. Havershaw operated on assumption. He assumed that his aesthetic instincts were universal, that his experience was the most relevant experience in any room. 4. And that people who had risen to prominence without his particular pathway had probably risen by accident, or by some temporary market correction that would eventually resolve itself. 4. He had nothing against Drummond personally. That was the thing that made it so clean. There was no malice to name, no incident to report. 4. There was only the way Havershaw would redirect a question aimed at Drummond in a meeting. Not rudely, just smoothly, the way you redirect a conversation at a dinner party when someone starts a story you've already heard. There was only the way Havershaw's name appeared first on the project materials, and then Drummond's, and then nobody else's, even though by month 3 it was Drummond who was attending the 7 a.m. site meetings, and Drummond, who had personally negotiated the revised drainage easement with the city engineering department, and Drummond, who had spent an entire Saturday in February walking the waterfront with a heritage consultant named Beverly Gozy Park to understand exactly why the community felt the original design proposal had failed them. 4. Beverly had looked at Drummond that Saturday afternoon, standing in the cold with the lake behind them and a roll of survey maps under his arm, and said, "You're not like the other ones they sent." Drummond had said, "What were the other ones like?" Beverly had considered this for a moment. "In a hurry," she said. 4. They were all in a very big hurry. The incident that people would later point to, when there were people pointing to things, happened on a Tuesday in April, at the monthly steering committee meeting for Lakeview Commons. The steering committee met in the large boardroom on the 14th floor, the one with the lake view, and the long walnut table that was original to the building, and had outlasted 4 different firms. 4. There were 12 people in the room, 4 Whitmore partners, 3 city representatives, 2 heritage advocates, Drummond, Yusuf, and a woman named Cassandra Vance, who was the city's appointed project liaison and who had, over the course of 11 months, become one of the most important people in this story without anyone at Whitmore quite understanding that yet. 4. Drummond presented the revised structural approach for the heritage-facing section of the development, DOM. The part that had caused 2 of the 3 previous project leads to simply stop returning calls. He had spent 40 hours on this section alone. He had consulted with 6 engineers, 3 heritage specialists, and 1 retired city planner named Augustin Ferreira, who had been involved in the original 1987 Chipperfield drainage dispute, and who turned out, over 3 cups of tea in his living room in Etobicoke, to know more about that corridor of waterfront than anyone currently employed anywhere. Drummond walked the room through the design. He was not a flashy presenter. 4. He didn't use the kind of language, Mitch, that made rooms feel excited in the moment, but confused afterward. He was precise. He was thorough. He answered questions before they were fully formed, because he had asked himself every possible question first. Cassandra Vance asked 3 technical questions. Drummond answered all 3 without checking his notes. 4. One of the city representatives, a man named Theo Aguilar, who had been quietly skeptical of the project for 2 years, leaned back in his chair at the end and said, "This actually addresses the drainage problem." And it does. Drummond said. The 1987 easement is incorporated into the revised utility corridor on page 11. The city engineering team signed off on the approach last month. The correspondence. Aguilar looked at him for a moment. Please, he said. 4. It was after this, when the formal presentation had ended, and the room was in the loose, slightly relieved energy of a meeting that had gone better than expected. 4. That Colton Havershaw stood up at the far end of the table and said, with a smile that was entirely genuine, I think we can all agree that the Whitmore team has really come through on this one. The Whitmore team, or Cassandra Vance, gathering her papers, glanced up. She looked at Drummond. Drummond was looking at the table. 4. He had the expression of a man who had heard this before, the particular composure of someone who has learned that reacting in the moment costs you more than it earns. He picked up his portfolio. Or he said something quiet to Yusuf. He walked out. Cassandra watched him go. Then she looked at Havershaw, who was already in conversation with one of the partners, laughing about something. She put her papers in her bag. 4. She took out her phone. She typed a name into her contacts and pressed call. 4. Drummond drove home to Scarborough that evening. He made dinner, jollof rice, the recipe from his mother that he'd made so many times he didn't need to measure anything anymore. He ate at the kitchen table with the radio on. 4. He looked at the drawings, spread across the other end of the table, the ones for a small project he was doing on his own time, for a community garden pavilion for a neighborhood association in Malvern that had no budget and a lot of heart, and had asked him 9 months ago if he'd help, because someone had told them he was the kind of person who helped with things like that. He looked at those drawings for a while. Then he washed his dishes, turned off the radio, and went upstairs. He did not lie awake thinking about Havershaw. This is the part of the story that matters, even if it's hard to explain why. Drummond did not spend his nights rehearsing what he should have said. He had learned, somewhere in his 40s, that the rehearsal only fed the thing it was supposed to prepare you for. He made a different choice each night. He thought about the work. He thought about the detail in the heritage facade that he still hadn't resolved to his satisfaction. He thought about Beverly's comment about the sight lines from the waterfront path. He thought about Augustin Ferreira's kitchen table and what it meant that a retired city planner had kept records for 35 years because he believed someone would eventually need them. Someone had. In May, the Lakeview Commons project was submitted for the city's development approval, the formal stage that, if it went well, would unlock the next phase of funding and commit the project to construction by the following spring. The submission package was 140 pages. Drummond had written or directly reviewed every word of it. His name appeared on the cover page as project lead. Below his name as senior partner, on account, Colton Havershaw. At the submission celebration, a catered thing in the 14th floor boardroom, expensive cheese, good wine. People saying the right things to each other. Drummond stood near the window that looked out over the rail corridor and talked with Yusuf and one of the junior engineers about drainage coefficients, which is what Drummond talked about at parties when he wasn't being asked to talk about something else. Havershaw gave a toast. It was a good toast. Named the firm, named the city partnership, named the vision. It named Drummond, briefly, as a key member of the team who brought important technical expertise to the process. There was applause. Drummond raised his glass. Yusuf, standing next to him, said very quietly, "You're the one who solved the 1987 drainage problem." "I know," Drummond said. "Doesn't that?" Yusuf stopped, started again. "To do that." Drummond looked at him for a moment. "The building either stands or it doesn't," he said. "My name on the toast doesn't change the building." Yusuf thought about this for a long time afterward. He thought about it the way you think about something that sounds simple. but keeps opening up the more you turn it over. 4. What Drummond didn't know, what nobody at Whitmore Associates knew, was that Cassandra Vance had made a call. Cassandra Vance had worked in city development for 19 years. She had seen a lot of project leads. 4. She had seen the type that came in with presentations and left before the hard questions started. She had seen the type that negotiated loudly and accomplished quietly. She had seen more times than she could count the type that did the work and watched someone else take the room. She had worked with Drummond for 11 months. She had watched him at 7 a.m. meetings, in cold site trailers, across heritage consultation tables, across a waterfront in February, with survey maps and real attention. She had watched him answer questions nobody else in the room could answer, without ever making anyone feel small for asking. The call she made from the boardroom parking garage that April afternoon was to a woman named Dr. Yvonne Castleberry, who was the chair of the Ontario Architecture Review Council, and who had, 3 months prior, reached out to Cassandra about a new commission the council was forming, a 10-year heritage corridor project spanning 6 municipalities. The kind of commission that came along once in a career. Dr. Castleberry had asked Cassandra if she knew anyone who understood both technical complexity and community consultation at that level. Cassandra had said she'd think about it. She stopped thinking about it that afternoon in April and started making calls. The letter arrived at Drummond's office on a Wednesday morning in June. It was on council letterhead. It was addressed to him, not to Whitmore and Associates, not to the project team, not to the account, to Elijah Drummond by name, because that was who Dr. Castleberry was writing to. 4. The letter invited Drummond to a meeting with the ORC Heritage Corridor Commission. It outlined the scope of the project. 4. It outlined in the careful language of official bodies that know what they are offering, what his role would be. Drummond read it twice. He set it down. He picked up his coffee. Then he picked up his phone and called Natalie. "There's something I should tell you," he said. She said, "You got it, didn't you?" He said, "I haven't said yes yet." She said, "Elijah." He said, "I know." He wasn't looking at the rail corridor. 4. He was looking at his drawings, the Lakeview drawings, the pavilion drawings for Malvern, the stack of books on his desk that were about things he read because they interested him. 4. Not because anyone had told him they were relevant. He was looking at all of it the way you look at something you've built without quite intending to. "Say yes," Natalie said. He said, 4. "I'm going to finish the Lakeview project first." She said, "Of course you are." He finished the Lakeview project. 4. The development approval came through in August. The city held a press event at the waterfront, on the very ground where the construction would eventually begin. And there were speeches and photographs, and a rendering on a large board showing what the Commons would look like in 3 years when it was built. The rendering had taken 6 weeks. Drummond had reviewed every detail of it. The heritage facade proportions, the sight lines from the waterfront path, the drainage corridor that ran invisibly beneath everything. 4. Solving a problem that had been unsolved for 35 years. Theo Aguilar, the city representative who had been skeptical for 2 years, stood next to Drummond at the event and said quietly, "I looked up the 1987 easement. You know what the original problem was?" "Yes," Drummond said. "Solved it. By going back to the original survey, and by talking to the man who was there," Drummond said. "Augustin Ferreira. He's 82. He lives in Etobicoke. He kept every record." Aguilar was quiet for a moment. "That's the kind of thing you can't teach," he said. "No," Drummond said. "You can only decide to do it." In the photographs from that event, Drummond is at the edge of the frame in most of them. In one, he's looking at the rendering board, not at the camera, with the expression of someone checking something that matters. Not performing, not positioned, just looking. Yusuf is next to him in that one. 4. also looking at the board. Later, Yusuf would say it was his favorite photograph from his entire career, though he couldn't fully explain why, even to himself. 4. Drummond's last day at Whitmore Associates was a Thursday. He gave 6 weeks' notice, which was 2 more than required. 4. He completed the full project handover documentation himself, thoroughly, so that whoever came next would have what they needed. 4. He trained Yusuf on 3 specific technical aspects of the Lakeview ongoing work that would need attention during construction. He wrote notes in the margins of the project files. 4. The kind of notes a good teacher leaves, not instructions, but signposts, small arrows pointing toward where the thinking should go. Havershaw called him into his office on the last afternoon. "I hope you know," Havershaw said, "that there was a path for you here." Drummond considered this. He was standing in Havershaw's office door, which had the lake view, and for the first time he registered that the lake view was, in fact, very beautiful. He wasn't sure he'd ever stopped to look at it before. He'd always been in motion in this building. There had always been somewhere to be. 4. "I know what path was available to me here," Drummond said. It was entirely calm. It was not an accusation, because Drummond had learned, slowly, 4, and not without cost, that the cleanest truth is usually the one that doesn't need a raised voice. "I'm going somewhere else." Havershaw was quiet for a moment. He was not a bad man. He was not even an unfair man, 4, by his own measure, which is the measure most people use. He simply had never, in 58 years, been asked to use any other project. Havershaw said. 6 municipality. Yes. That's a significant commission. It is. Havershaw looked at him across the desk. Something moved through his expression, something that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite apology, but was perhaps the beginning of the distance you need to travel to get to either of those things. He extended his hand. Drummond shook it. 4. The Ontario Architecture Review Council's Heritage Corridor project was announced publicly in September, in a press release that listed the project commission lead's name first, without a senior partner above it, without a team name softening the attribution. Dr. 4. Yvonne Castleberry sent Drummond a copy before it went out, as a courtesy, because that was how Castleberry operated. She was precise about credit, the way some people are precise about structural load calculations, because she understood that misattributing one is about as safe as misattributing the other. Drummond read the release at his kitchen table. The jollof rice was on the stove. 4. The Malvern Pavilion drawings were in the corner, finished, waiting for him to deliver them that weekend. The pavilion had no budget, no press release, no credit line. It had a neighborhood association that had asked him, because someone told them he was the kind of person who helped. He was. On the Saturday, 4. Drummond drove to Malvern and unrolled the drawings on a folding table in a community center gym, 4, in front of 11 people who had been trying to build a garden pavilion for 4 years and had mostly been told it was too complicated. He walked them through every page, answered every question. He said, as he had once said to Yusuf, and as he had said in different ways throughout his career, the building either stands or it doesn't. Let's make sure it stands. 4. One of the women at the table, an older woman named Frances, who had started the Garden Association in 2008 and who wore a scarf in the red and gold colors of somewhere Drummond didn't want to assume, 4, looked at the drawings with her hands flat on the table, the way people touch things they believe in. "This is exactly what we wanted," she said. "How did you know?" "You told me," Drummond said. She looked at him. "In March," he said. "I came and walked the space with you. You said you wanted people to sit in it and feel like they were somewhere, not just outside somewhere. I didn't forget." Frances was quiet for a moment. The gym was quiet, the kind of quiet that has warmth in it. "No," she said. "Well, you didn't." The same courtyard where people had been dismissed, redirected, had their work absorbed into someone else's handshake. That same ground, in other forms, in other buildings, had been quietly, thoroughly, permanently changed. Not with noise, not with a moment that anyone photographed, with plans, with records, with the simple insistence of showing up and doing the work and knowing that the building, in the end, tells the truth.